I wanted to build a company that my father never got a chance to work for. That single sentence, hidden like a quiet fault line beneath Howard Schultz's entire life, is the key that unlocks every decision he ever made. It's the origin of the tension he carried from the streets of Canarsie into the boardrooms of Seattle. The source of the intensity that pushed him to turn a commodity as old as civilization into a cultural movement. And once you understand that this wasn't a business mission, but a personal vow, almost a form of redemption, everything else falls into place. The ambition, the stubbornness, the contradictions, the moral edge he fused into a profit-driven machine, all of it traces back to a child watching his father fall through the cracks of America and promising himself he would one day build something that made human dignity a corporate advantage, not a casualty. He didn't start with power. He started with shame, and shame is a much stronger engine than ambition. His father's broken leg, the loss of income, the humiliation of being fired without benefits, these were not memories to him. They were instruction manuals. They told him something about the world, that organizations can be transactional, that leadership can be cold, that systems can discard people with stunning efficiency. And as he grew older, these impressions calcified into a worldview. It wasn't abstract philosophical thinking. It was a visceral sense that business could either crush a person or elevate them. And if someone didn't redesign the machinery from the inside, nothing would ever change. This is the psychological origin of Starbucks. Not the espresso bars of Milan, not the romance of coffee culture. The trip to Italy was a spark, but the combustible material had been accumulating in him for decades. When he walked the streets of Milan and saw what an espresso bar could be, community, ritual, belonging, he wasn't seeing a business opportunity, he was seeing the antidote to isolation. He was seeing everything his father never had. He was seeing a model of work that offered dignity. And once that idea lit up inside him, there was no going back. He wanted to bring that feeling home, to recreate it at a scale that would make the world feel a little less harsh. But this is where the interesting contradiction appears, and it's a pattern that repeats across his entire career. Schultz wasn't discovering a vision, he was discovering a mission disguised as a business. And missions are dangerous because they demand sacrifice. They demand a level of belief that can destabilize reasonable judgment. They push a person to ignore odds, ignore criticism, ignore safe paths. Schultz didn't want to build a company. He wanted to prove something to the world. And that kind of drive can either create greatness or destroy the person carrying it. When he returned to Seattle and pitched the idea of coffee bars, the original Starbucks founders rejected him. They saw themselves as purists, importers, roasters, academics of the bean. They wanted to protect the integrity of the product. Schultz wanted to build a theater of human connection. Their vision was intellectual, his was emotional. Their focus was on the bean, his was on the person drinking it. Most people would have accepted the rejection. Most would have returned to their job, told themselves the market wasn't ready, maybe tried again in a few years. Schultz didn't, because beneath the surface, he wasn't fighting for a coffee bar, he was fighting for the validation of a childhood vow. He was fighting for the right to reinvent what work could mean. So he did what founders do when the world says no. He manufactured the conditions in which the world would eventually say yes. He left Starbucks, raised capital from small investors who believed in him more than the market did, and created Il Giornale, a company that existed for the sole purpose of demonstrating that his vision was not only viable, but inevitable. And this is the first major pattern in Howard Schultz's operating system. He turns rejection into fuel, but not through anger, through inevitability. He doesn't persuade people, he outlasts them. He forces reality to adapt to his conviction, not the other way around. This is a dangerous trait. In the wrong hands, it becomes delusion. In Schultz's case, it became propulsion. When Il Giornale succeeded, when lines formed, when people returned 3 times a day not for the coffee, but for the feeling, he had empirical proof that his intuition had been correct. And here the loop becomes even clearer. He wasn't building stores, he was building environments. He wasn't selling beverages, he was selling a moment of belonging. Every cup was a small declaration of what work could be when dignity wasn't optional. But success didn't soften him, it intensified him. Because now he wasn't just chasing a dream, he was chasing the future. And the future requires ownership. So when the original Starbucks decided to sell, Schultz moved with a level of urgency that bordered on obsession. He raised the money, negotiated aggressively, and took control. It wasn't just a business acquisition, it was a takeover of destiny. In that moment, Starbucks became the physical manifestation of his worldview, the platform on which he would encode every lesson he had learned about leadership, culture, and the fragility of human experience inside corporate structures. This is where the story becomes more interesting, because once he took control, the company didn't grow through strategy alone. It grew through narrative. Schultz told a story so compelling that people didn't just buy in, they internalized it. Employees became partners, not because of branding, but because it satisfied a psychological need he understood better than any executive of his era. People want to be part of something that feels meaningful. People want to be seen. People want to feel that the place they work in understands them as humans, not as labor units. This is the underlying pattern. Starbucks was built on a foundational thesis that emotional value is economic value. The cafe was an emotional experience, engineered with the precision of a product. Warmth wasn't an accident, it was strategy. Connection wasn't emergent, it was manufactured. And the feeling of being welcomed, known, remembered,
another layer,
this
is
was
where
the
the complexity of Schultz deepens. The same emotional intensity that powered Starbucks also made him obsessive about control. He wanted every store to feel the same, every barista to embody the mission, every detail to reinforce the narrative. This wasn't micromanagement, it was craftsmanship. But it came with a trade-off: speed versus soul. And every fast-growing company eventually faces the same dilemma. If you scale too slowly, you're irrelevant. If you scale too fast, you dilute the essence. Schultz's genius was that he refused to accept this trade-off as inevitable. Instead, he designed Starbucks as a system that encoded humanity into process. But this encoding required enormous discipline. It required training programs, rituals, design standards, and a near-religious focus on consistency. And in the early years, Schultz's personal intensity served as the enforcement mechanism. His faith in the mission was so strong that others conformed to it, not out of fear, out of belief. He was teaching them not how to run a store, but how to hold a standard. And it was working. Stores were opening, customers were returning, and the company was moving with an energy that suggested inevitability. But inevitability invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites pressure. And pressure reveals what a founder is truly made of. The next stage of the story: Wall Street, scale, international expansion, crises, reinvention, will expose the deepest truth about Howard Schultz, that his mission wasn't just to build Starbucks. His mission was to prove that a company driven by conscience could outperform companies driven only by profit. Starbucks wasn't a coffee chain, it was a confrontation with the idea that kindness and performance are incompatible. He didn't know it yet, but the moment Starbucks entered the cadence of public markets, the true test of his philosophy began. Because the instant a company goes public, it is forced to speak two languages at the same time: the language of the balance sheet and the language of the soul. One is quantified quarterly, the other is quantified across decades. One scores you by the penny, the other judges you by the culture you build. Most CEOs choose one. Schultz refused. And in that refusal lies the most fascinating contradiction of his leadership. Wall Street wanted predictability, efficiency, margins, and the smooth geometry of a growth curve. Schultz wanted humanity, craft, emotional resonance, and the inefficiency that comes with caring too much. Wall Street wanted a coffee retailer. Schultz wanted a global movement that used coffee as a medium. These two ambitions are not merely different, they are structurally incompatible. And yet he was determined to hold them together with sheer force of will, as if an organization could be both a beating heart and a disciplined organism without tearing itself apart. The early years after the IPO revealed something essential about him. Schultz didn't see Wall Street as an enemy. He saw it as a constraint, like gravity, something to be understood, managed, and occasionally defied. But he also understood that constraints can sharpen thinking. The pressure of public markets forced him to translate intuition into frameworks, passion into process, story into strategy. He had to justify investments in people to analysts who measured value in ROI spreadsheets. He had to argue that giving stock options to part-time baristas was not charity, it was competitive advantage. He had to explain that culture was not an accessory to performance, but a prerequisite for it. This is one of the rarest insights from his journey. Schultz turned values into a strategy, and then turned that strategy into a financial weapon. By elevating employee benefits and training and treating baristas as partners, he reduced turnover so sharply that Starbucks' cost structure improved relative to competitors who paid less and cared less. What looked soft was actually hard-edged efficiency disguised as generosity. And this inversion, where kindness becomes a business advantage, became one of his signature moves. But kindness is not cheap. It requires financial sacrifice. And the moment coffee prices spiked, when the cost of beans soared beyond anything they had seen, he faced a moment that many founders never survive. The moment when your values demand a price you're not sure you can afford. Most leaders fold here. They compromise quietly. They tell themselves it's temporary. They sacrifice the long-term soul to solve a short-term problem. Schultz didn't. And this refusal is what separates him from the average CEO, because in that crisis, he was forced to choose between defending margins or defending the people who made the company what it was. And his instinct, almost reflexive, was to protect the partners. It wasn't an act of loyalty, it was an act of identity. If he abandoned them, he would become everything he had sworn not to be. The childhood vow would break. The mission would collapse into ordinary corporate behavior. So he made the harder choice. He absorbed the financial hit. He kept benefits intact. He reinforced the culture instead of cutting it. And in doing so, he sent a message that would echo for decades. This company will not sacrifice its people for convenience. That message became the backbone of Starbucks' internal psychology. It told every partner that their effort wasn't transactional. It told them they belonged to something that valued their humanity. And that sense of belonging became the invisible engine that powered Starbucks through its most aggressive phase of growth. But growth introduces another form of danger, not financial, but philosophical. Because the moment a company begins expanding at hyperspeed, the founder must confront an existential question. Can the soul scale? Can the intimacy of a small cafe survive when there are hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands of them? Or does growth dilute everything? Most companies answer this question with resignation. They accept mediocrity as the natural byproduct of size. Schultz refused this logic. His insistence on maintaining the feeling of a neighborhood cafe at global scale is one of the most ambitious experiments in business history. To pull this off, he turned the company inward again and again, demanding reinvention before stagnation could take root. Reinvention wasn't a response to crisis, it was an operating principle. He wanted Starbucks to behave like a startup, even when it was a giant. He wanted curiosity to outrun bureaucracy. He wanted the energy of Il Giornale to survive inside a multinational. And this desire led to one of his most underestimated strengths, the ability to redesign his own role. Most founders freeze. They cling to the identity that got them to the top. Schultz evolved. He transitioned from operator to global storyteller, from executor to architect, from doer to symbol. He recognized that the company needed ideas more than instructions, narrative more than directives. And he built a leadership team capable of delivering the operational rigor he no longer had time to perform
didn't mean
himself.
detachment. He was still the keeper of the flame, still the person who protected the intangible essence of the brand, still the one who decided when the company was veering toward corporate mediocrity. His leadership was less about decision-making and more about calibration, constantly realigning the company with its original intention. And the more Starbucks grew, the more essential this calibration became. The tension became visible again when Starbucks began expanding internationally. Japan was the first major test, and the question wasn't operational, it was cultural. Could the ritual of the American Starbucks translate into a society with its own deeply ingrained tea culture? Could the idea of the third place survive across contexts? Schultz believed it could, but belief is not strategy. Strategy is adaptation. So he made a move that revealed just how willing he was to destroy his own assumptions. He entered Japan through a joint venture, giving up control in exchange for cultural interpretation. This is where his humility appears, not the soft humility of personality, but the hard humility of someone who understands that expertise does not travel unmodified. He let local partners reinterpret the experience, adapt the store design, adjust the rituals. The mission remained intact, but the expression became local. And the result validated one of his most important principles. Scale requires letting go of control without letting go of identity. But perhaps the most revealing moment in this era wasn't a big strategic move at all. It was the way he treated brand building not as a marketing exercise, but as a human one. He believed a brand is not what a company says, it's what people feel inside its walls. It is built one person at a time, a philosophy that seems almost naive until you see it deployed at scale. When millions of people walk into your stores every day, the cumulative emotional weight of small interactions becomes a massive economic force. Schultz understood this before the rest of the retail world caught on. And yet, even as the company skyrocketed, another danger emerged: the risk of becoming generic, a chain, a commodity, a predictable, standardized experience devoid of personality. Schultz despised this possibility. He fought it with design teams, customized layouts, localized aesthetics, meticulous store compositions. He wanted every Starbucks to feel intentional, not manufactured. He wanted the illusion of individuality at scale, a paradox that required both emotional sensitivity and industrial discipline. But beneath all of this, the scaling, the reinvention, the cultural adaptation, the design obsession, ran a subterranean fear: losing the soul. He knew what happened to companies that grew too fast. He knew what happened when the founders stepped back and the story stopped being told. He knew that efficiency has a way of crowding out empathy, and he spent years trying to build mechanisms that would prevent that outcome. Yet the truth is that no mechanism is enough, not for long. So the real test of whether Starbucks would remain true to its origin would always fall on leadership, not systems. And leadership, in Schultz's case, always traced back to a singular emotional center: the desire to build the company his father never had. Whether it was international expansion, Wall Street pressure, commodity price shocks, operational complexity, or brand dilution, every decision was weighed against that core promise. And that promise was about to be challenged again, this time not by markets, but by success itself. Because the greatest threat to a mission-driven company is not hardship, it is victory. Hardship sharpens the mission, victory blurs it. And as Starbucks grew into an American cultural symbol, the question looming in the background became unavoidable. Could a company this big stay small in spirit? Could Schultz protect the soul while the world demanded scale? Success, in its purest form, is an amplifier. It magnifies culture, magnifies strengths, magnifies cracks. And as Starbucks continued its climb, something subtle began to happen, something that only founders with deep intuition ever sense early enough to intervene. The company was winning everywhere. Financial markets were validating the model, customers were forming habits around the stores, partners were internalizing the mission, and growth was accelerating with an almost gravitational inevitability. But beneath the surface, the early signals of complacency started to appear. Not complacency in the traditional sense. Starbucks was still a ferociously hardworking company, but complacency of meaning. The mission that had once felt radical, almost insurgent, began drifting toward normalcy. Familiarity bred predictability, and predictability is the silent enemy of a founder's vision. Schultz could feel it. The company was hitting home runs, but he sensed the danger of mistaking momentum for invincibility. That instinct, the paranoia of a founder who knows how quickly soul can evaporate, pushed him back into reinvention mode. He began shifting his own role again, not because he wanted distance, but because he understood that founders can become bottlenecks if they cling too tightly to the early operating system. His job wasn't to repeat early victories, it was to make them irrelevant by creating new ones. Reinvention wasn't an event, it was a discipline. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of his leadership. Schultz wasn't addicted to change, he was allergic to stasis. To him, the worst possible outcome wasn't decline, it was stagnation, the slow suffocation of a company's imagination. So he demanded curiosity from an organization that had every excuse to relax. He pushed teams to question assumptions even when those assumptions were producing record results. He forced the company to preserve the scrappiness of Il Giornale inside the body of a corporation that was becoming too large to remember its own origin story. And then, like a stress test administered by the universe itself, the coffee price crisis hit. This was not a theoretical problem. It was a direct strike at the foundation of the business. Costs were exploding, margins were shrinking, and analysts were circling with the kind of short-term logic that destroys slow-burning missions. It was the exact scenario that exposes whether a company's values are real or just slogans. Because when cost structures collapse, every ideal is suddenly a luxury. Benefits become negotiable. Quality becomes negotiable. Training becomes negotiable. Culture becomes negotiable. The spreadsheets light up with the tempting efficiency of cutting what is meaningful.
Because Schultz viewed this moment not as an expense issue, but as a character issue. He had built Starbucks on the belief that humanity and performance were not mutually exclusive. If he cut the benefits programs now, the health insurance, the stock options, the commitments that made partners feel like owners, he would not just be trimming cost, he would be tearing out the psychological spine of the company. He would be proving himself wrong. He refused. He accepted the financial pain as the necessary price of moral consistency. And that decision did more than protect culture. It strengthened it. Partners saw that values were not decorative, they were structural. They were central to how the company operated under duress. And because of that, loyalty didn't just remain intact, it grew. The emotional contract, the real source of Starbucks service quality, deepened, and that loyalty paid dividends for years. This willingness to choose long-term fidelity over short-term convenience
is the fork in the road where many companies lose their identity. Schultz did not. And because he didn't, Starbucks emerged from the crisis not weakened, but clarified. The company now had proof, not theory, that purpose could coexist with scale, that compassion could survive under financial pressure, that culture could be an asset rather than a cost center. But the reinforcement of values introduced another complexity. The company was becoming too large, too visible, too woven into the daily rhythms of millions of people's lives. And with that visibility came the risk of homogeneity. Starbucks was at risk of becoming a category instead of a brand, a cliché instead of an experience. Schultz understood this threat with visceral clarity. He had built Starbucks as an antidote to isolation, a place where people could feel a sense of belonging that was increasingly rare in American life. If the stores became interchangeable and sterile, if they began to resemble formulaic chain architecture, the entire mission would collapse. So he waged war against sameness. He invested in store design like it was product R&D. He pushed for local adaptation, for unique layouts, for materials that made each cafe feel intentional rather than mass-produced. He treated architecture as part of the emotional palette of the brand. Every material, every sightline, every acoustic choice mattered. Schultz was not trying to build a chain. He was trying to build a collection, locations that shared a philosophy, not a blueprint. This obsession with resisting the cookie-cutter effect was not aesthetic indulgence, it was strategic. If the stores felt personal, then the experience felt personal. And if the experience felt personal, then customers would form habits. Habits become revenue. Revenue becomes scale. Scale becomes cultural imprint. The architecture was part of the flywheel. But the bigger the flywheel spun, the more Schultz felt the gravitational pull of focus. Advisors, analysts, and internal voices told him repeatedly, "Stick to coffee, stay in your lane, specialize." But Schultz understood something counterintuitive. Too much focus makes companies blind. Myopia kills opportunity. The real risk was not wandering, it was narrowing. Because if Starbucks defined itself narrowly as a coffee company, it would eventually be disrupted by convenience, price, or alternatives. If it defined itself as a third place, an emotional ecosystem, then it could expand in ways competitors couldn't anticipate. This is why the moments that look like digressions, introducing music, creating Frappuccino, experimenting with new product formats, were actually strategic bets on cultural relevance. Frappuccino wasn't a beverage, it was a bridge to new customers. Music wasn't an add-on, it was identity building. Schultz was extending the perimeter of what Starbucks could be, not chasing revenue, but deepening meaning. He refused to let the company become static. He refused to let predictability replace imagination. And underneath all of this, beneath the strategy, the expansion, the reinvention, was the recurring idea that shaped his entire worldview. The belief that leadership must be an act of the heart. Not sentimentality, not softness, but emotional clarity. The kind of clarity that forces a leader to confront their own reasons for existing. Schultz believed that a company should be an expression of the leader's deepest convictions, not a compromise of them. And he believed that people could sense the difference. You cannot fake sincerity at scale. You cannot mass-produce meaning. You cannot outsource soul. This philosophy becomes most visible in his approach to responsibility. He did not see corporate citizenship as an obligation or a marketing narrative. He saw it as an extension of identity. The company should do good because the company should be good. This wasn't theoretical, it was operational.
Decisions about sourcing, community involvement, ethical commitments, and partner treatment weren't appendices to the business. They were part of the business model itself. In Schultz's mind, social responsibility was not a cost. It was the compound interest of trust. As Starbucks reached new heights, this trust became the company's most valuable currency. It insulated the brand from mistakes. It created emotional loyalty that competitors couldn't replicate with discounts or convenience. It allowed Starbucks to become something more than a seller of beverages. It became a place where people could participate in a ritual that made their day feel slightly more human. And yet, for all the external success, the greatest battle Schultz faced was always internal, not within the company, within himself. Because the deeper a leader goes into the architecture of a mission-driven organization, the more they must confront the question that eventually challenges all founders. How much of the company is me, and how much of me is the company? Schultz had built Starbucks from the inside out. His identity was woven through its structure. His childhood wound shaped its values. His vision shaped its market. His intensity shaped its culture. The question looming ahead was not whether Starbucks could succeed, it was whether Starbucks could remain itself when the founder eventually stepped back, whether the soul he had engineered could survive without the person who
something
carried
that
it.
outgrows you is that success slowly pushes you away from the center of the thing you created. Schultz had always been the gravitational force holding Starbucks together, its storyteller, its moral compass, its chief protector against dilution. But as the company expanded into an international empire, a new question emerged. Could a system built so heavily on his emotional architecture sustain itself without his daily presence? Most founders ignore this question until it's too late. Schultz did not. He understood that the moment a company becomes dependent on the psychology of one individual, it inherits that individual's limits along with their strengths. So he began lifting himself out of the operational trenches again, not because he wanted distance, but because he wanted the company to develop muscles that weren't borrowed from him. He needed leaders who could run the system without his constant calibration. He needed structures that institutionalized the soul he had built, turning intuition into discipline, narrative into doctrine, and sensitivity into process. This wasn't detachment, it was stewardship. He was teaching the company how to breathe on its own. But even as he stepped back, he maintained an emotional connection to the stores themselves. He wandered them like a craftsman inspecting his work, feeling the temperature of the experience, sensing the energy of partners, listening for the tone of customer interactions. These visits weren't symbolic, they were diagnostic. Schultz believed you could read the health of the entire company by observing the smallest details in a single store: the pacing behind the bar, the music volume, the cleanliness of a table, the way a barista greeted someone, or the absence of warmth in a rushed interaction. Small things were never small to him. They were expressions of the company's internal state. This is one of the deepest insights from his leadership. Culture leaks through behavior long before it collapses in metrics. When a company starts losing its soul, it doesn't show up first in financials. It shows up in the way people stop caring about the craft. It shows up in the erosion of the emotional standard. Schultz sensed these micro shifts with near instinctive accuracy, and anytime he saw them, he treated them as alarms, not annoyances. But the world outside the stores was changing too. As Starbucks scaled, so did the expectations of society. Corporations were increasingly expected to take positions, support causes, act as moral agents.
Schultz understood the pressure, but he also understood the danger of performative responsibility. To him, authenticity mattered more than optics. If Starbucks was going to engage in social issues, it had to do so from conviction, not trend following. This is why his approach to responsibility was always rooted in the question, what do we stand for when no one is watching? It was in this context that he doubled down on initiatives that many companies treated as philanthropic accessories, but that he saw as strategic infrastructure. Ethical sourcing, community involvement, partner benefits, environmental commitments. These weren't boxes to check, they were extensions of the company's identity, and they gave Starbucks something that competitors couldn't replicate: moral resilience. When the public trusts that a company's intentions are genuine, it forgives mistakes more readily, engages more deeply, and becomes emotionally invested in the mission. But while Starbucks was becoming a symbol of a new kind of corporate responsibility, Schultz was fighting a different enemy: the pull toward formula. As the company expanded, the pressure to standardize everything intensified. Standardization is efficient. Standardization is scalable. Standardization is predictable. But standardization is also soulless. And Schultz was allergic to anything that smelled like soullessness. He believed that standardization should protect quality, not erase individuality. This belief manifested in his war against the cookie-cutter chain identity. He insisted that each store retain a sense of uniqueness, a sense of place. The design teams he empowered were not decorators, they were cultural engineers. They crafted environments that could hold emotional weight. Narrow alleys in old cities required different layouts than open suburban spaces. Local architecture influenced material choices. Schultz wanted each store to tell a story, even if most customers never consciously noticed it, because subconsciously, people feel the difference between intention and convenience. This approach, treating design as an element of strategy, became one of Starbucks' structural advantages. Competitors could copy drinks, they could copy prices, they could copy locations, but they couldn't easily copy an environment that felt curated, warm, and lived in. Competitors built stores, Starbucks built atmospheres, and atmospheres generate loyalty. As the company pushed further into international markets, Schultz's philosophy of adaptation deepened. Japan had been the first test of cultural translation, but it wasn't the last. Entering new countries required a careful balance: protect the core ritual, but localize the expression. What looked like a cup of coffee was actually a vessel for cultural negotiation. Starbucks became a global brand not because it replicated the American experience everywhere, but because it allowed each market to reinterpret the experience through its own lens. And yet, for all his commitment to adaptation, Schultz maintained an unyielding devotion to one idea: the central promise of Starbucks, the third place, the feeling, the emotional refuge. Everything else, product extensions, menu variations, localized offerings, was negotiable. The feeling was not. The feeling was the product. This conviction led to another profound insight. Focus is dangerous if it becomes narrowness. Schultz resisted the pressure to specialize exclusively in coffee, because specialization can trap a company in a shrinking category. Starbucks was never meant to be defined by what it sold. It was meant to be defined by how people felt when they engaged with it. This philosophy gave him permission to pursue ideas that would have seemed unrelated in a traditional business framework: music, frappuccino, merchandise, seasonal rituals. All of them expanded the emotional perimeter of the brand. And while these initiatives were successful, what made them powerful was the psychological effect inside the organization. They kept the company curious. They kept teams inventive. They created a culture that saw possibility instead of constraint. Schultz's refusal to get myopic was not just a strategy for market expansion, it was a strategy for cultural
became
vitality.
more complex, more global, more multifaceted, Schultz's internal compass never changed. He continued returning to the same central idea, the same emotional anchor, the same origin point that shaped him as a child. That flame, the metaphorical yard-side candle he referenced again and again, was not symbolic, it was structural. It reminded him of the responsibility he carried. It reminded him that leadership is not about being admired, but about being accountable to the people who build the company alongside you. This sense of responsibility manifested in ways that were often invisible from the outside. He made decisions that looked costly, but preserved dignity. He invested in training not because it boosted metrics, but because it raised standards. He protected quality at times when efficiency seemed more logical. He wove emotional intelligence into the DNA of a company that could have easily become mechanical. And through all of this, through the growth, the reinvention, the cultural engineering, the global expansion, he was still driven by the same unchanging mission: to build the company his father never had. That mission was not nostalgia. It was propulsion. It shaped every store, every policy, every standard, every refusal to compromise. It was the psychological engine beneath the corporate structure, the narrative that gave Starbucks its rare coherence. Toward the end of this chapter of his life, as Starbucks became one of the most recognized brands in the world, Schultz reached a point of reflection. Not the reflection of someone searching for meaning, but the reflection of someone who had already found it and was responsible for keeping it alive. He understood that growth without soul was failure, that success without purpose was hollow, and that leadership without heart was just management. And so he returned to the beginning, to the lesson he learned watching his father suffer under a system that saw him as disposable, to the vow he made to himself, to the belief that a company should never treat its people the way his father was treated. That belief, more than any strategy, any product, any expansion, any innovation, was the foundation of Starbucks. I wanted to build a company that my father never got a chance to work for. The line that opened the story returns now, not as an origin, but as a destination. Because after decades of expansion, reinvention, crisis, triumph, and the relentless pursuit of an ideal that often seemed incompatible with the mechanics of global business, Howard Schultz arrived at a simple truth. The mission he had carried since childhood was not something he fulfilled once, it was something he had to fulfill every day. A vow is not completed, a vow is maintained. And that is the real heart of his journey. Starbucks didn't become a global institution because Schultz had a clever idea. It became one because he had a wound that never fully healed, and instead of letting it harden him, he let it guide him. The child who watched his father's spirit break became the man obsessed with building an organization where dignity wasn't a luxury. Every store was a rejection of that early memory. Every partner program was a correction. Every investment in training, in benefits, in design, in culture was a small act of defiance against the indifference he saw in the world. This is why Starbucks feels different. Not because of the coffee, not because of the menu, not because of the branding. It feels different because it was built to repair something, first in Schultz, then in others. This intention permeates every part of the company, from the way a barista greets a customer, to the way a store is laid out, to the way the company weathered crises without discarding the people who held it together. A company built on a wound has to be careful, disciplined, protective. It has to honor its own origin story. And that origin story required Schultz to make decisions that most leaders would never entertain. To ignore market pressures when they contradicted values, to sacrifice margins to protect partner benefits, to expand internationally without surrendering identity, to fight against homogeneity even when homogeneity was operationally easier, to reinvent himself repeatedly to prevent the company from becoming trapped in his own shadow. These were not normal decisions. They were decisions made by someone who believed he was carrying a responsibility, not a business. But responsibility is heavy, and it forces a leader to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Schultz had to face the paradox that the company he created to honor his past might one day betray that past if left unguarded. He had to face the tension between scale and soul, between growth and meaning, and between efficiency and humanity. And through each iteration of Starbucks' evolution, he kept recalibrating, kept returning to the same anchor. Protect the feeling, protect the people,
Leadership in his
protect
worldview
the promise.
wasn't about being visionary. It was about being vigilant. It was about making sure that the values encoded in the earliest days, when the company was fragile, when it depended entirely on belief, did not erode as success made those values seem optional. Success has a way of softening discipline. Schultz refused to allow it. He believed that a company must stay hungry even when it is adored, must stay humble even when it is envied, must stay human even when the world treats it like a machine. This is why the Starbucks story is so instructive for anyone building or leading anything meaningful. It is a demonstration of the cost of maintaining soul inside scale, the cost of refusing shortcuts, the cost of leading with conviction when the market rewards conformity. Schultz proved that values are not a marketing tool. They are a strategic advantage only if a leader is willing to defend them when they become liabilities. And he did, again and again. In the final arc of this journey, as he stepped back and watched what Starbucks had become, a global ritual, a cultural symbol, a daily companion to millions, he understood something profound. The company's real achievement was not its footprint, or its valuation, or its influence. It was that the flame he protected, the one he spoke about in terms of the yahrzeit candle, was still alive. The company still radiated the warmth he felt in Milan, the dignity he wanted to give his father, the humanity he spent his entire life trying to encode into the machinery of business. And that brings us back to the beginning, to a boy in a small Brooklyn apartment watching the world treat his father as disposable, to the quiet anger that formed in him, to the conviction that work should never diminish a person, to the idea that a leader's job is to carry the weight that others shouldn't have to. Starbucks didn't erase that memory, it redeemed it. Every partner who received health benefits, every barista who felt seen, every customer who felt welcomed, every store that served as a refuge, each one was a small rewriting of his family history. This is the real lesson in Howard Schultz's life. A company is only as strong as the conviction of the person who builds it. Strategy can be copied, products can be replicated, capital can be outbid, but conviction, deep personal conviction forged in the friction of lived experience, is irreplaceable. It shapes culture in ways PowerPoints never will. It creates standards that outlast the founder. It gives a company a spine. And conviction is what shaped every chapter of this story. Conviction is what allowed him to confront Wall Street without surrendering identity. Conviction is what allowed Starbucks to scale without becoming hollow. Conviction is what allowed a simple beverage to become a global ritual. And conviction is what allowed a child's vow to become a multinational institution. In the end, Schultz's journey is not about coffee. It is about the courage to turn the most painful part of your life into the foundation of something that makes other people's lives better. It is about the willingness to lead with heart in a world that often rewards those who lead without it. It is about proving that dignity can be operationalized and that humanity can be scaled if you build the systems to protect it. And so, the loop closes. I wanted to build a company that my father never got a chance to work for. He did. And in doing so, he built a company that millions of people wanted to be part of, not because of what it sold, but because of what it stood for. A company where the flame stayed lit.